rather than having the right emotions, the right thoughts, or avoiding the wrong emotions, the wrong thoughts. When you have sovereignty over your mind, you can skillfully work with whatever your mind offers up. So then emotions, anxiety, unpleasant one, or confidence, a pleasant one, doesn't control my behavior. It informs my behavior. So when I have sovereignty over my mind, I'm being informed by my thoughts and feelings rather than being controlled by them.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks. I hope you enjoy.
This idea of normalizing emotions, which you briefly mentioned there and also talked about in the workshop, can you go into that more? Because I think that's very important because from a coaching perspective, if the messaging is always, I need to be calm and composed when I'm in these competitive environments, if that's what people think they need to be doing, then they feel like a failure if they're not in that state. So I think, can you expand on the normalizing emotions part? And then also the values. So someone's like, what does that mean, acting in line with my values? Or because I think that's a piece I've also been expanding on, is spending more time helping athletes explore what their values are and then aligning that with their goals. Because you make a great point that you don't have to ask an Olympic athlete or a Paralympic athlete what their goal is. It's going to be a gold medal, right? You don't, that's just makes sense. But the values piece, so two parts. One is, can you expand on the normalization of emotions? And secondly, expand on the values and why those are important and how to go about that.
Yes, those are great questions. So let's start with the normalization of emotions. This comes back to the metaphor of the mind being a thought and emotion producing factory. So emotions are normal, first of all. And we have this habit of labeling emotions as positive or negative, as opposed to what emotions do is they provide information. And they communicate, they motivate, and they illuminate. And you're spot on when you say that we have this sense of I should feel calm in this pressure-filled moment, and when I'm not, then I'm a failure, right? So this is where the judgment mind will be quickly coming up and offering that judgment that I'm a failure, which just tends to make things worse, because then again, I'm going to be more likely to be stuck in my head. So let's come back to this idea of emotions are normal, and why it's important to normalize them rather than pathologize them. It's normal to be anxious before an exam. It's certainly normal to be anxious before the gold medal race at the Olympic Games. It's actually quite abnormal to be calm in that environment, because again, the equation is, if the outcome means the world to you and the outcome is uncertain, then most likely unpleasant emotions will arise. So I want to normalize the emotions, and I want to communicate that it's very difficult to feel calm in a stressful environment, but it is quite possible to act calmly in a stressful environment. And I think a wonderful example for me of that is, this is a sport I'm not that familiar with, but is baseball in the US, right? In the World Series, when that reliever comes on the field, very often those guys, they walk like super slow. So in that moment, that reliever is acting calmly, even though he might not feel calm, right? So in a non-threatening environment, I said this earlier, it's fairly easy to feel calm. But in a threatening environment, that's more difficult, but I can act calmly in that environment. So it is possible in a stressful environment to act mindfully, where it's very difficult to act calmly. And this is again where the normalization of emotions can be so very helpful. And now tying that into the values piece, emotions, they illuminate what is important to us. And this question of what is important to us gets at values. Values are different than goals. Goals are about the destination, what I want to get to and what I want to get. Values, they're more like a direction. Values are about how I want to be, whereas goals are about what I want to get. So this question of what is important to me, what do I want to stand for in a given situation, begins to tease out what I value. Another way to get at values, and this is one thing I do with my Olympic athletes, is to ask, well, tell me about an athlete you admire, and then tell me what you admire about them. And when I ask that question, the answer usually isn't, the guy who won 22 Grand Slams like Rafa Nadal. The answer might be like Serena Williams said, is when I watch Nadal, I see so much intensity, so much honor, so much effort go into every shot. I want to be like him. So that answer again highlights things that Serena Williams values, right? Intensity, effort, passion, and so forth. So that gets at values, how I want to be in a given moment, irrespective what the outcome might be. So on this Olympic journey, on this Paralympic journey, I want the athletes to be very clear on what is actually important to you. How do you want to be, as opposed to what is it you want to get?
And I can imagine that once you've identified those values, I'm also thinking from a golf perspective, which is the field I usually work with, is being able to embody those values on the golf course or in your field and what those are. So if your value is being present or taking one shot at a time, embodying that is irrespective of the outcome. It's not related to winning that tournament or shooting a certain score. It's just about the behavior, which kind of relates to that behavior versus emotional goals.
That's correct. Yes. And indeed, being focused could be somebody's value, right? And then, so the technical definitions of values is desired global qualities of ongoing actions. Right? So a value is something I choose. It's not something that's being enforced upon me, because then it's a rule. And values are different than rules. So value is something I choose, right? So it's desired. It's a quality of action. Okay. So I can choose to be intently focused, right? And it's a global quality. I can apply it to different areas. So yes, for the golfer, very much I can choose to be focused on one shot at a time, so to speak, right? And then it gets back to, okay, so then I work my pre-performance routine. I might check in again, what's the weather check? What is present? And can I be open to that? And then take actions anyway in the presence of those thoughts and feelings.
And to expand upon what you said there, this act of confidence, it's not meaning fake it till you make it, right? It's meaning the action of confidence. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, it is not fake it until you make it, because that's about generating a feeling, right? So thank you for prompting me on that. I like to make a distinction between the feeling of confidence and the action of confidence. And one way to play around with that is just notice when you hear athletes in interviews talk about how this victory gave them confidence. Right? So the feeling of confidence came after an action the athlete took to get that victory. So now let's explore, what actions did you take? All right, what behavioral actions did you take in that competition? And you took those actions in the absence of the feeling of confidence. So the feeling of confidence almost always comes after an action, and I can take the action irrespective of whether or not the feeling is present. So I don't need to feel confident to take an action of confidence, is my argument.
Yeah. That's a very important point. And I want to clarify for the listeners that, when you say act confidence, it doesn't mean acting like I am confident. It means it's taking an action in a confident manner.
Yes.
That is confident. And then the feeling follows that. Great.
Yes. So again, I don't know anything about golf, right? But what would I see if I see a golfer act with confidence, say in putting? Right. So this is where let's have you be my golf expert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most likely you can answer that question. What action would that golfer take?
Yeah, they would be very focused on their process, on their pre-performance, pre-shot routine. They would be in the moment, analyzing the green, the slope, and then they would be, if it's a player I would know that I've seen, their routine would be very consistent. They wouldn't be rushed and be out of sorts compared to 2 holes prior. So there would be some consistency, and then they would be executing the putt to the best of their abilities.
Yeah, very good, very good. I think it's a wonderful, again, description, right, of taking actions.
Because I think it's important for listeners, athletes, to understand these different perspectives and approaches to mental performance and sports psychology. We talked about mindfulness, ACT. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. Can you explain what that is and how is it very different to what we've talked about so far in this conversation?
Yeah, they're a bit related in the sense of that sort of CBT is often referred to as second wave behavioral therapies, and ACT would be third wave behavioral therapies. The first wave, which is behaviorism, right, where you just focus on changing behaviors, observable behaviors rather than covered behaviors. Covered behaviors are, thoughts and feelings that we might have, and what CBT focuses on, and I've sort of worked in that frame for quite a while, is to that you when you have unpleasant emotions such as anxiety, you look at the thoughts that generate or come with those feelings, and then you try to change those thoughts to change the feelings. So CBT is more about symptom reduction, right? And again, I contrast that with my sort of somewhat radical statement: I don't care how you feel, I don't care what you think, to communicate that I'm not interested in symptom reduction. Again, symptom reduction works really well in an office with a sports psychologist or with a psychologist, but it's much more difficult in that moment at the Olympic Games when the money is on the line and the outcome is highly uncertain. And again, put yourself into those shoes, right? You've worked all your life for this one moment, and you get one chance, and that chance will never come again. And then you're aware of the pressure, you're aware of the anxiety, and if in that moment you think you need to change those feelings, CBT can actually help you. But in that moment, at the Olympic Games, you have very little time to make a change like that. And so to me, ACT is the much more elegant, skillful approach to that moment. Can I be aware of it? Can I be open to it? And then again, can I come back to taking effective actions in the presence of those thoughts and feelings? This is how those two approaches are very different, right? Again, CBT is about changing the symptoms you experience. ACT is about skillfully working with those thoughts and feelings by taking effective actions.
Okay. I just wanted to spend a minute just covering that because I think it's important. I want the athletes to be informed and understand what the options are out there and how they are different, because depending on who you work with, if they have an ACT approach or a mindfulness approach versus a CBT approach, the way they're going to work with you is going to be very different, right? Correct. So I think it's important that the athlete is an informed consumer and knows what they're signing up for. And I think it's good to also, if you talk to someone, if you're trying to find someone to work with and you ask them that question, they should have some sort of answer to what their approach is. And if they don't, it's probably an indicator that there's no kind of philosophical or sort of theory behind their approach to performance.
That's correct. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Indirectly, you mentioned, what do athletes think they want? And basically they think that they want confidence. So what is it that athletes truly want?
Yes, that's a great question. What is it that athletes truly desire from sports psychology, from someone like me? And my argument is sometimes they actually don't know what they truly want. So again, I'm trying to build a case, right? And what that eventually leads to is this idea of sovereignty over your own mind. So sovereignty, the right to choose your way. And what I mean by that in this context of sport is with the mind, and this gets back again at this conversation about CBT versus ACT, is rather than having the right emotions, the right thoughts, or avoiding the wrong emotions, the wrong thoughts. When you have sovereignty over your mind, is you can skillfully work with whatever your mind offers up. So then emotions, anxiety, unpleasant one, or confidence, a pleasant one, doesn't control my behavior. It informs my behavior. So when I have sovereignty over my mind, I'm being informed by my thoughts and feelings rather than being controlled by them. And I think a simple example here is this idea of road rage, right? Some stranger cuts you off on the highway, the emotions flare up, you go into road rage. That would tell us that your emotions now are running the ship and you have lost sovereignty. Sovereignty would mean that you can notice, here is anger flaring up. Anger isn't going to help right now. I don't have to listen to anger. I can come back and just focus on steering this car in a safe way. So I'm very much interested in helping the athletes have sovereignty over their own mind.
And if I look at golf, that's one thing. The ability, hit a bad shot, you lose your ball. That skill, which also relates to your attention, is the currency of performance. Being able to make an informed decision, I think it's similar to this road rage idea, is I hit a really bad shot, I have to tee it up again, and I'm allowing the emotions to steer the ship. I don't pick up on the wind change direction, and I didn't pick up on that I had a better option where I could drop the ball in a better position because I was so controlled by emotions, rather than being able to step back, become aware of those thoughts and the emotions, and then make the ideal decision given the circumstances that you're in. So being able to avoid doubling down on your mistakes is very, very important, because in golf especially, it's so easy to, you have one bad shot and then you compound your error. And a lot of that is mental, is that you've made an error and you weren't able to defuse or step away and then recenter yourself and be present and continue. You acted compulsively.
Yeah, I think that's a great description of that process unfolding. And the tell usually is, I have to make a makeup shot now, right? A great shot now. And how that can become quickly very compulsive. And as you identify so correctly, is then you actually miss all the attentional cues that are right there for the taking and that you want to be aware of, right? And you then have the emotions control your behavior. And then again, you're not a sovereign over your mind.
Yeah. And the first time I heard you talk about this idea of sovereignty, that really resonated with me, because that made me think that is really the true skill of being able to act according to my values in a performance environment, while there are thoughts, emotions, feelings that exist, as opposed to being dependent and reliant on achieving certain emotional states and feelings in order to perform.
Correct. Yeah, that's spot on. Yes.
I wanted to now touch on something that I'm not really familiar with, but you kind of hinted on in a previous conversation, social meditation. What is social meditation, and can you provide some insights into how you're using it, in what capacities you're using it, and why you're using it?
So social meditation is basically an evolution of mindfulness practice that was developed by a guy named Kenneth Folk and then also Vince Horn. And I learned these techniques from Vince Horn. And what you do in social meditation is you practice aloud with other meditators. And the idea here is that by practicing aloud, you sort of have this built-in feedback loop that actually makes the practice more effective. So when you practice mindfulness on your own, particularly early on, it's not that uncommon that you get lost in the story in your head. And rather than focusing on your breath or bringing your attention back to the breath, your mind wanders off and takes you on a journey to wherever, really, right? And with social meditation, you sort of skillfully sidestep that trap, because as you practice with others, it tends to keep you more in the present moment. And then also we're social beings. So this is just really a fun way to practice with others and to hear what is on the mind of others. Because then again, that normalizes your own experience in a way. So I found these approaches, from Kenneth Folk and Vince Horn, really, really practical, really effective. And I use them all the time now with my athletes, particularly with team sports, but also with individual sport athletes. Because again, when you practice alone, if you're an introvert, that tends to work well. But from a motivational perspective, practicing with others is more energizing. So I also feel like these social practices are really helpful for individual sport athletes, where you can practice together. So I found these approaches to be super fascinating, super practical, and very, very helpful.
And so can you walk us through what does that look like as an example? Because like in my mind, if I think of meditation, I'm thinking silence, alone, in my room or somewhere quiet. How does this verbalizing, maybe there are different approaches, but just some sort of example of what does that look like when you're doing it with another person?
Yes, so we could do like a practice called sixth sense noting. This is what's called an open awareness, open monitoring practice, right? Where we use the six senses, seeing, hearing, feeling, touching, tasting, smelling, and thinking as potential angles of attention, right? So if I practice this by myself, it'll look something like this: seeing, hearing, seeing, tasting, seeing, smelling. All right, stop. So let's just do this by myself, right? Just noticing where awareness lands, on which of the six senses it lands, and then note it out aloud. Now let's do this together, taking turns. So this is ping pong style, right? I go, you go, I go, you go. Okay.
So it's just where my attention goes to. I say where my attention goes to.
Where does your attention, on which one of the six senses does your attention land? Okay. If it's your turn and you don't know what to say, then just say pass or don't know. Okay. And the ball goes back to me. Okay? All right. You good?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, here we go. Seeing.
Tasting.
Thinking.
Seeing.
Touching.
Feeling.
Feeling.
Smelling.
hearing, seeing,
pass.
Great, and stop. Right, just to give you a taste how social meditation works. I was just two of us, right? But you can do this 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, lots of different techniques. And here we just worked on awareness, right? Just which one of the senses. This is sort of one aspect of the spectrum is open awareness, and then we have focused attention. Usually, mindfulness practices fall between those 2 continuums.
Very interesting. So it's a whole new, I guess, dimension of adding that into, I can see just from that in a team environment. And also, I could imagine it's a new way to introduce people to this and what could be perceived as a more fun way, I guess, to do it with my teammates, with my friends, with other people, rather than usually be introduced as this is something to do alone by yourself.
Right.
So very, very, very interesting. From all years of your experience in this field as an athlete and as a practitioner, coach, what advice or recommendations would you have for athletes and or coaches, or just questions you'd want them to reflect on and think about?
Well, I think with regards to takeaways, right, is be curious about how your mind works. So be open to that. And that with that curiosity, also bring some kindness to the way your mind works. So bring some compassion to yourself. So when a thought arises such as, I'm a failure, you can be curious about that thought, and you can bring some compassion to that judgment. And when you do that, you're in a much better position to take charge of your attention. Because again, attention is the currency of performance. And it matters to be in the moment. And you can do that irrespective of what your mind offers up.
Because you work a lot with team sports, do you find there are differences in incorporating mindfulness act-based approaches in teams versus individual sports?
Well, with a team, obviously you have other people to practice with, right? That's a benefit. Whereas if individually you got to find other athletes, a team that's already a given. One thing that is the same for me is the idea of practice. So mindfulness is a practice. It's not enough to think you can be mindful, as John Kabat-Zinn puts it, in the big moment, and thinking you draw on it, right? Because the big moment will overwhelm you. So mindfulness is a practice, and he uses this beautiful phrase of it's digging trenches. Okay, where the sand comes back down, and you gotta keep digging. So I want to encourage the athletes to look at mindfulness and psychological flexibility, just like they look at the rest of their sport. Is you practice your skills. The same applies to mindfulness, and this is again where I find the social practice is so helpful, is because I think they're fun to do together, and so in that sense, they're a bit more motivating.
I think that's a very important point. The practice, and especially with golfers, is putting in the time ahead of time, or in other sports as well. That's what I see sometimes as well, is that there's just this assumption that I've gone through a workshop, I remember what he said or what she said, and now I'll just apply that when the big moment comes, and it'll just be there, right? And what you're saying there is that, no, we need to be diligent. Just like I go to the gym, I don't go to the gym only when I want to, before a big bodybuilding event. I go to the gym consistently if I want to get some sort of results, or I eat in a proper way consistently if I want to improve my body composition. Same thing applies for mindfulness. and that also relates to a book, Peak Mind, which you had mentioned once, was this idea of, over time, over 4 weeks, 12 minutes a day, at least from that research, we start seeing actual changes. But if you're only doing it once a week for 3 minutes, it's not going to have the same impact as if you commit to it, just like we commit to other things. And I think the difference is just that it's more fun, or it seems to more directly relate to performance when we're working on our golf swing, or working on our pitch, or working on our dribbling, whereas sitting or doing a social mindfulness practice doesn't necessarily directly look like it's relating to my performance in the same way. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, you mentioned, Peak Brain, Amishi Jha's book, sort of summarizing, her research last 25 years as a neuroscientist who does a deep dive into attention and performance, and how attention, degrades under stress, in high stress intervals, such as, for me, the Olympic Games, and that degradation of attention that then degrades performance can be counteracted through the practice of mindfulness. And what her research has shown is that 5 times a week of 12 minutes a day makes a measurable difference in your ability to sustain attention in a high stress interval. So it gets this idea of practice matters, repetition matters, and that mindfulness is a practice, and we can practice with our mind just like we can practice a golf putt, throwing a baseball, whatever it may be, right? So this is about practicing skills.
To conclude, I wanted to just ask if you had what projects you're working on, and if you had any book recommendations for listeners related to your work and your fields, or just books that have been impactful in your life and your career.
Well, on the mindfulness side, with regards to books, certainly I mentioned Amishi Jha's book. Would want to mention Richard Davidson and Goldman, Altered Traits, which summarizes all the research on mindfulness. Fascinating book. John Kabat-Zinn's books have been super impactful for me. Full Catastrophe Living, Wherever You Go, There You Are, Coming to Our Senses. I had the privilege to train with him. And then on the sports side, I always enjoy autobiographies. Mentioned obviously Rafael Nadal's autobiography, Chris Hoy's autobiography. Looking forward to digging into Nathan Jen's autobiography that's coming out here soon. Novak Djokovic's autobiography, he talks quite a bit about mindfulness in Serve to Win. And then, like Phil Jackson wrote a lot about mindfulness, starting with Sacred Hoops, but also in 11 Rings. So it's a coaching perspective. So that's quite the list there. With regards to projects that I'm playing around with right now is I want to play around with this idea of mindfulness retreats for athletes. First, 1, 2, 3 day retreats, where I think the aim would really be is to make a switch. And what comes to mind here, speaking of books, is that the switch framework from the Heath brothers, right, where they talk about that if you want to make a switch, a change in behavior, you need to address the rider and the elephant. So use this metaphor of the rider is the cognitive, the thinking, the rational aspect, and then the elephant is the emotional aspect. But the emotional aspect is actually quite powerful and often resistant to change. So can I make a switch in this sort of retreat, switch from I want to feel the right way to I don't care how I feel, I want to act the right way, and then to get the ball rolling, and then have this option of these social noting practices, so you keep the trenches, and then sort of a next level from there is you could actually also perhaps get athletes to do mindfulness retreats, so silent retreats, where it's like a training camp for the mind, where you practice mindfulness for 7, 10 days, whatever. and really work on those skills even more. And again, athletes, they're familiar with training camps, physical training camps, but I think mindfulness actually offers a mental training camp for the mind as well.
Very interesting. I'm excited to learn more about that. And I think that's a very, very good idea to start to offer that. And mindfulness retreats exist, but especially for athletes that aren't necessarily aware and of these types of things that exist, and exposing them to those things in a way positioned as a training camp, the way you have, preseason training camp, spring training, all these things, same way, but for the mental side of things. Dr. Haberl, I really enjoyed this interview. It was a real privilege to speak with you and to learn from you and have you expand upon all these ideas that I think are extremely valuable for people who want to perform in any part of their life, professionally, even if they're not professional athletes, just at a high level in their personal life. All these tools and these practices and concepts can be applied just to enrich our lives in a variety of ways. So I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me, Noah. That was a wonderful summary, and yes, just spot on. These tools are valuable for us in all areas of life. So thank you for the time.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter